The classroom was silent except for the faint growl of empty stomachs. A cracked chalkboard leaned tiredly against the wall, its surface gray and smudged from years of use. Children sat on old benches, their eyes wide, some clutching their bellies, others too weak to even look up. At the front of the room stood Miss Evelyn, a teacher whose paycheck barely paid for her rent, whose shoes were worn thin, whose nights were spent grading papers by candlelight. Yet her voice, though soft, carried a strength that hunger could not break. "My children," she said, steady but tender, "you cannot learn if your stomach is louder than your mind." She opened her cloth bundle on the desk. Inside, 2 loaves of bread, a few apples, and the porridge she had cooked before dawn. Her hands shook as she laid them out, not from fear but from weakness. She had not eaten. Still she smiled. "Come," she said, pushing the food forward. "There is enough to share." A boy in the front row, James, whispered, "But teacher, this is your food." "You won't have any." Evelyn knelt to his level, her tired eyes glistening. "James, a hungry child cannot grow. A hungry child cannot dream. Let me worry about me. Today you eat." And so they did. Small hands reached out, clutching bread as if it were treasure. Evelyn watched them eat, her own hunger forgotten in the glow of their relief. James, though, didn't forget. That moment carved itself into his heart. Later that day, when the class was dismissed, James lingered at the doorway. His shirt was torn at the sleeve, his shoes full of holes, but his eyes were bright. "Teacher," he said softly, "why do you do this? Why give us your food when you have nothing left?" Evelyn smiled faintly, sitting on the edge of her desk. "Because I know what hunger feels like. James, I know what it's like to sit in class with your stomach hurting so bad. You can't hear the words. I promised myself, if I ever stood in front of children, I would never let them feel that way if I could help it." James bit his lip, fighting back tears. He slipped the last piece of his bread into his pocket, whispering, "One day I'll remember this. One day I'll make her proud." Weeks turned into months. Miss Evelyn repeated the same routine, saving coins, skipping meals, choosing bread and apples instead of new clothes, porridge instead of blankets. Her colleagues shook their heads. "You'll wear yourself out, Evelyn," one teacher said. "These children won't remember. You can't save them all." She only smiled. "If I save even one, it will be enough." That one was James. Every evening he worked odd jobs, selling newspapers, carrying crates at the market, just to afford pencils and books. Each time he thought of giving up, he remembered Evelyn's words. "Hunger does not define you. Your choices do." One rainy night, Evelyn sat at her tiny desk, counting her last coins. There wasn't enough for rent, food, and her children's bread. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Tomorrow they will still eat." The next day, she arrived with an even smaller bundle of food, yet still enough for everyone to have a taste. She smiled as she passed the pieces around, her stomach aching. But James noticed. "Teacher," he whispered, not touching his bread, "did you eat today?" She forced a smile. "Don't worry about me, James. Eat." But James didn't. Instead, he broke his bread in half and slid it toward her. "You taught us to share. Today, you share with me." Her eyes filled. That single act, from a hungry boy, was proof her lessons were sinking in. Years began to pass. New faces came and went, but Evelyn never stopped feeding, never stopped believing. She grew older, weaker, yet her fire never dimmed. And James? He grew stronger. He studied, he worked, he pushed himself beyond what anyone expected. When people doubted him, he remembered his teacher's sacrifices. When life got hard, he whispered her words, "Never let hunger silence your dreams." One late evening, Evelyn sat grading papers by candlelight. Her stomach was empty again, but she smiled faintly. "One day," she whispered to the darkness, "one of them will remember." And miles away, James, walking home from his third job with torn shoes, looked up at the sky and murmured, "I promise, teacher, I won't forget." James grew taller, but hunger never really left his side. His childhood was marked by late nights working, early mornings studying, and long walks in shoes that should have been thrown away years earlier. But each step, no matter how painful, was fueled by the voice of his teacher. Your choices, James, not your hunger, your choices. At 16, he worked 3 jobs just to stay in school. He sold newspapers at dawn, hauled crates at the marketplace during the day, and scrubbed dishes in a tiny diner at night. Sometimes he fell asleep with his head on his books, ink smudging against his cheek. Other boys his age were giving up, disappearing into the same cycle of poverty that had trapped their parents. But James clung to Evelyn's words like a lifeline. One evening, as he cleared plates at the diner, his boss barked, "Faster, James! Customers don't wait for you!" "Yes, sir," James said, his hands moving quickly despite the ache in his arms. Later that night, as he walked home in the rain, his torn shoes soaked through, he looked up at the cloudy sky and whispered, "Teacher, I'm still trying. I won't forget." Meanwhile, Miss Evelyn grew weaker. She still stood in her classroom every day, her smile hiding the exhaustion that weighed on her bones. But at night, alone in her small room, she coughed into her pillow, her body thin from years of sacrifice. The little coins she earned as a teacher were stretched until they almost tore, yet she never once arrived at school without food to share. One afternoon after class, Evelyn found James waiting outside her door. His clothes were ragged, but his eyes were full of determination. "Teacher," he said, handing her a bundle wrapped in newspaper. "This is for you." She opened it and gasped. Inside were 3 bread rolls, still warm. "James, where did you—" "I bought them, from my wages. You can't keep giving us food without eating yourself." Evelyn's eyes filled. She touched his cheek gently. "You shouldn't spend your money on me." James shook his head firmly. "You spent everything on us. This is the least I can do." For a moment, the roles reversed. The teacher became the student, and the student became the giver. That exchange of bread became James's unspoken vow. He would not only remember her kindness, he would multiply it. Years rolled forward. James won a scholarship to a small college far from home. Leaving his town was the hardest thing he had ever done. On the morning he left, Evelyn stood by the school gate, her frail figure wrapped in a faded shawl. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "promise me one thing." He swallowed hard. "Anything, teacher. No matter where life takes you, never forget where you came from, and never stop feeding those who are hungry, not just with bread, but with hope." James hugged her tightly, whispering, "I promise." College was another battlefield. Surrounded by wealthier students, James often felt like an outsider. He wore second-hand clothes, skipped meals, and worked nights cleaning classrooms, while others studied in libraries. There were days when exhaustion clawed at him, when doubt whispered in his ear that maybe his dreams were too big. But every time he wanted to quit, he remembered Evelyn, standing in that shabby classroom, handing out bread with shaking hands. "If she could give when she had nothing, then I can fight when I have little." Slowly, step by step, James pushed forward. He studied harder than anyone, his professors astonished by his determination. He graduated with honors, the first in his family to hold a degree. But his journey didn't stop there. He applied for jobs, facing rejection after rejection, each no cut deep. But he remembered Evelyn's words, "Hunger does not define you. Your choices do." So he kept choosing to rise, to try again, to stand tall even when the world tried to push him down. Finally, after months of struggle, he landed a position at a small company. The pay was meager, but it was a start. James worked harder than anyone else, arriving first and leaving last, taking every opportunity to learn. His bosses noticed. Promotions followed. His life began to change, slowly but surely. But even as his clothes grew finer, even as his meals became regular, James never forgot the taste of that shared bread in Evelyn's classroom. Years later, while sitting in his modest office, James opened his worn wallet. Tucked inside, folded carefully, was a scrap of paper. On it was a line Evelyn had once written on the chalkboard for her students. "Kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way back." James stared at it, his eyes burning. "Teacher," he whispered, "I'm almost there. I'm not the millionaire yet, but I will be. And when I am, I'm coming back for you." Back in their town, Evelyn grew older and weaker. Her hair turned gray, her hands shook, but she still stood in front of her students. She still fed them. She still believed in them, even as her body betrayed her strength. She lived in the quiet hope that somewhere one of her children would remember, and James did. Late one night in a faraway city, James sat in his office surrounded by papers and plans. His company had grown, his investments were paying off. For the first time, he saw the number in his bank account cross into what he once thought was impossible: 7 figures. He had become a millionaire. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and whispered, "It's time." The promise he made as a boy, the vow whispered to the sky, the bread shared on rainy mornings, it all came rushing back. He had not forgotten, and now he was ready to return. The city lights glimmered outside James's window as he sat in silence. Success was finally his. He had money, recognition, and comfort. But none of it felt whole. None of it felt complete. Because deep down, every achievement, every promotion, every sleepless night of study and work was fueled by a single memory: a woman in a worn dress, handing out bread with trembling hands and a smile that defied hunger. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had searched for weeks to find: the old school's office. A tired voice answered. "Yes, this is St. Mary's Primary. How can I help you?" "Please," James said, his voice tight with emotion, "can you tell me if Miss Evelyn is still teaching there?" There was a pause. Then the voice softened. "She is, though she's not well these days. She refuses to stop teaching, but age and illness have taken their toll." "Are you a relative?" James closed his eyes. "No, I'm one of her children." 2 weeks later, a black car pulled up in front of the small school. The children outside paused, wide-eyed, as a tall man stepped out, dressed in a crisp suit. His shoes shone, his watch gleamed, and his face was calm, but his eyes carried a fire of memory. "It was James." The children whispered. "Who is he?" They had never seen someone arrive like this. But James didn't head to the principal's office or speak to the other teachers. He walked straight down the narrow hallway he remembered so well, past the chipped walls and squeaking floors until he reached the classroom. There she was, Miss Evelyn. Her hair had turned silver, her back was slightly bent, and her hands shook as she wrote on the chalkboard. The classroom was nearly the same as he remembered: old benches, cracked walls, but her presence filled it with warmth. James froze in the doorway. For a moment he was a boy again, hungry, barefoot, waiting for her to turn and smile. Then she turned. Her eyes met his. For a long, breathless moment she stared, as though trying to place him. And then her lips curved into the faintest smile. "James?" His throat tightened. He stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Teacher." The children turned, curious, watching as their frail teacher slowly walked toward the tall man who now stood trembling like a boy. James knelt in front of her, tears spilling freely. "You told me never to forget," he whispered. "And I didn't. Every meal I ate, every success I gained, every door I opened, it was because of you. Because you fed me when no one else would. Because you believed I was more than my hunger." Her hands shook as she reached out, touching his face gently. "Oh, James, I always knew one of you would remember." "I promised," he said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a folded, faded piece of paper, the scrap of chalkboard writing she once gave her students. Kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way back. Her eyes filled. You kept it. I lived by it. That day, James did more than visit. He transformed the school. Within weeks, he paid for new benches, fresh paint, new books, and daily meals for every child. He built a program so no student would ever have to learn on an empty stomach again. The once-forgotten school became a place of pride, a beacon of hope. But his greatest act was for Evelyn. He bought her a comfortable home near the school, hired a caretaker, and made sure she never had to work another day unless she chose to. Yet Evelyn, humble as always, returned to the classroom, not to teach full days, but to sit with the children, to smile, to tell them stories about how even the smallest kindness can grow into something greater than they could ever imagine. One afternoon, sitting in her new home, Evelyn asked James quietly, "Why spend so much on me, James? You've already done enough." James shook his head firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "No, teacher. You gave me more than food. You gave me belief. You gave me a chance to dream. You saved my life with bread that wasn't even enough for you. How could I ever repay that? This isn't charity. This is gratitude." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. "And what will you do with the rest of your life?" James smiled, tears shining. "Feed others. The way you fed me, not just with bread, but with hope." Years later, Miss Evelyn passed away peacefully, her legacy carried not just by James, but by every child who had ever sat in her classroom. At her funeral, hundreds gathered, former students, families, teachers, neighbors. But the man who stood at the front, with tears streaming down his face, was James. He spoke softly, his voice breaking but strong enough for all to hear. She was not rich. She did not have gold or land or fine clothes. What she had was greater, kindness. She fed hungry children when she herself was starving, and because of that, I stand before you today. I am her proof that one act of kindness can echo across a lifetime. She gave me bread, but what she really gave me was a future, and with that, the crowd wept. James dedicated the rest of his life to building schools, feeding children, and creating opportunities for the poor. Everywhere he went, he carried Evelyn's lesson. Kindness is never wasted. Years later, when people asked him, "What made you who you are?" he would always answer the same way: "A poor black teacher who had nothing, but gave me everything." Every act of kindness matters. Just like Miss Evelyn's bread, the smallest gift can become the greatest seed. Remember this tomorrow. When you see someone in need, even a simple act could change a life forever. If you were touched by this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Black Saga. Leave a comment, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness.